The cell was not, by any objective standard, the worst place Ethan Vale had ever slept. That distinction belonged to a drainage ditch outside a forward operating base on Kepler's moon, where he had spent 14 hours face down in something that smelled like industrial solvent and regret. The cell, at least, was dry. The walls were smooth, some kind of pale mineral compound that had been pressed into perfect uniformity, the kind of surface that suggested a civilization which had long ago decided that if something was going to imprison you, it should do so with architectural dignity. There were no visible seams in the stone, no rust, no encouraging graffiti from previous occupants, which Ethan found both disappointing and faintly ominous. The energy barrier that served in place of conventional bars was a soft, continuous blue-white along the cell's front edge. It didn't crackle or hum aggressively, the way barriers in human detention facilities tended to, as if the technology itself wanted you to know it was serious. This one simply glowed, quietly and without drama, like a nightlight designed by someone who had genuinely considered the prisoners' sleeping comfort before deciding to trap them. Ethan had tested it on the second day, one careful touch with 2 fingers, and received a jolt that was less painful than it was deeply insulting, the sensation of being firmly corrected by a piece of furniture. 11 days! He had been counting by the shift changes of the guards and by the meal deliveries, which arrived with the kind of mechanical regularity that suggested whoever ran this palace's logistics had never once in their professional life been 5 minutes late for anything. The food itself was adequate in a way that raised more questions than it answered. Dense, nutrient-correct, vaguely savory, and completely impossible to identify. He had eaten it every day without complaint, not because it was good, but because the alternative was not eating it, and Ethan was practical before he was principled. He was doing push-ups when Voss arrived for the morning shift. He had started keeping count somewhere around day 4, partly for physical maintenance and partly because it gave him something to report to himself. He was on 47 when he heard the particular cadence of Voss's footsteps, slightly uneven, the left boot always landing a half-beat heavier than the right, a pattern Ethan had catalogued with the automatic attention of a man trained to notice things in the absence of anything more useful to do. Voss was young. That was the first thing you noticed, and then you noticed the ears. Long, elegantly tapered, extending past the crown of his head in the way common to all the Thesserans Ethan had encountered, which was, in fairness, a relatively small sample size consisting almost entirely of the soldiers who had detained him and this one guard. Voss kept his uniform immaculate and his ceremonial sidearm polished to a degree that went well beyond regulation requirement and into something closer to a personal philosophy. He polished it when he was bored. He polished it when he was nervous. On one occasion, Ethan had watched him polish it during what appeared to be a private, unresolved argument with his own thoughts. "You're early," Ethan said, pushing himself up from the floor. "By 4 minutes," Voss said, which was not a denial. "Something wrong with your shift schedule or something wrong with you?" Voss set down the meal tray on the sliding panel beside the barrier and did not immediately answer, which told Ethan more than an answer would have. He was holding something else, a flat sealed document, rigid and formal in its casing, bearing a wax-like impression in deep violet that Ethan didn't recognize but which had the unmistakable visual grammar of official authority. The kind of seal you put on things when you want the recipient to understand that whatever is inside has been decided by someone who does not repeat themselves. "This came for you this morning," Voss said, feeding it through the barrier slot carefully, as though the document itself warranted delicacy. Ethan picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. The seal impression showed a stylized geometric pattern, 2 interlocking shapes that suggested both a crown and some kind of orbital diagram, which he found thematically ambitious for a wax stamp. "What is it?" "A formal summons." "A formal..." Ethan turned it over. His name was on the front, spelled out in Thesseran script with a phonetic human alphabet transcription beneath it, which meant someone in this palace had taken the time to make sure he could read his own summons, which he thought was either very considerate or very ominous, and he could not currently determine which. "Summoned by who?" Voss had begun polishing his sidearm. This was, Ethan had learned, a reliable indicator of a conversation Voss found uncomfortable. "Queen Thessera," Voss said. The cell was quiet for a moment. Somewhere in the ventilation system, the distant sound of what might have been ceremonial music drifted through, thin and reedy, like a very formal occasion happening to someone else. Ethan looked at the summons. He looked at Voss. Voss was now polishing with the focused intensity of a man who had decided that the sidearm was the most important thing in the room. "Is this the part," Ethan said, "where I'm supposed to look frightened, or do I have a moment to finish my push-ups?" "You have until the second bell," Voss said. "That's approximately 40 minutes. Generous." Ethan set the summons on the edge of the sleeping shelf and picked up the nutrient tray. Whatever was on it today had a slightly different color than yesterday's offering, marginally more orange, which felt significant without being decipherable. "Voss, genuine question. In your professional estimation, on a scale of mild diplomatic inconvenience to summary execution, where does a direct summons from the Queen generally land?" Voss's polishing slowed. "That varies," he said carefully. "Helpful, thank you. Most summons are procedural. And the non-procedural ones?" A pause. "Also procedural, technically. The Queen prefers formal structures." Ethan ate in silence for a moment, looking at the glowing barrier and thinking about the sequence of decisions that had delivered him to this particular chair, in this particular cell, on this particular planet. The navigation failure had been the proximate cause. The distress signal had been the permissive cause. His own decision to follow it. That had been the cause he was least able to explain in any after-action report. Because the honest version included the phrase, "I was curious and I thought I could handle it." And those were not phrases that read well in official military documentation. He had crossed the border. He had been detained within 20 minutes by a patrol that had appeared with the swift professionalism of people who monitored their territory seriously. He had not fired a shot. He had not resisted. He had explained himself as clearly as he could to soldiers who spoke his language with varying degrees of fluency, and had been brought here, to the Thessaran Royal Palace complex, which was either a great honor or a very bad sign, and placed in this cell, and fed these unidentifiable meals, and given access to a sanitation facility that operated on principles he had not entirely determined, and had spent 11 days doing push-ups and arguing with Voss, which was not, as military situations went, the worst outcome he had navigated. He finished the meal. He picked up the summons again. The seal was still there, still authoritative, still carrying the visual weight of a decision already made by someone who outranked him considerably. He thought about the 40 minutes he had remaining. He considered doing 17 more push-ups, which would bring him to a satisfying round number. He considered briefly composing some kind of personal statement, and then discarded the idea because he had never in his life written a personal statement that did not make him sound like a different, more organized person than he actually was. "Voss," he said. "Yes. Does this palace have a rating system for the cells?" Voss looked up from his sidearm, uncertain whether this was a serious question. "I want to leave feedback," Ethan said. "The mattress is better than I expected. I think that deserves acknowledgement. Probably 2 stars, 2.5. Voss stared at him for a long moment, with the expression of someone who had prepared for many possible conversations this morning and had not prepared for this one. Then he went back to polishing his sidearm, and Ethan Vale sat with a royal summons in his hands and 40 minutes left of being only a prisoner, and the ventilation music drifted on. They gave him clean clothes before the escort arrived, which he interpreted as either a good sign or a very sophisticated form of cruelty, the palace's way of ensuring that whatever happened next, it would happen to someone who was presentable. The clothes were Thessaran in cut, which meant they sat slightly differently than anything he had worn before, the collar higher, the sleeves tapering to a precise point at the wrist in a way that felt ceremonial without being uncomfortable. They fit, which bothered him more than if they hadn't. Someone had known his measurements. He wasn't sure when. The escort was 4 soldiers, 2 ahead, 2 behind, moving in the particular formation of people who had practiced this enough times that it had stopped being a decision and become a reflex. They didn't speak to him, and he didn't speak to them, and the corridor received them all in silence, broken only by the sound of boots on pale stone. Ethan walked and looked, because looking was the only productive thing available to him, and because 11 days in a cell had sharpened his attention to the quality of someone who has been, for a significant period, without anything interesting to observe. The palace corridors were long and high-ceilinged, constructed from the same pale mineral compound as his cell, but here carved and shaped with a deliberateness that made the material feel intentional rather than institutional. Light came from sources he couldn't locate directly. Some distributed system embedded in the walls themselves, producing an illumination that had no shadows, or rather had shadows in all the correct places without producing the harshness of a single-point source. It was the kind of lighting that would cost an extraordinary amount to replicate on any human station, and here appeared to simply be how corridors worked. They passed a series of archways looking out over a courtyard below, and through them he caught briefly the quality of the sky. A pale, slightly greenish atmosphere, the sun sitting at a higher angle than Earth standard. The light it produced clean and faintly silver. He had seen this sky from the small high window of his cell, but only in strips. Seeing it in width was different. It was genuinely beautiful, in the way that things are beautiful when you've been looking at the same four walls for 11 days, and almost anything with a horizon would qualify. Then they turned away from the archways, and the corridor narrowed slightly, and then opened, and the doors at the end were the largest he had seen since arriving. They were not dramatic in the way human architecture used drama. No sharp angles, no aggressive ornamentation, no deliberate intimidation through scale alone. They were simply very large and made of something dark that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, and they opened inward without sound, which meant their hinges or equivalent mechanisms were maintained with a precision that was itself a form of statement. Everything in this palace, Ethan was beginning to understand, communicated through the quality of its maintenance. The room beyond was full of people, not chaotically full, not the press of a crowd, but populated in the organized hierarchical way of a court that knew exactly where everyone stood, literally and otherwise. They were arranged in a rough crescent around the central space, dressed in varying registers of formality, and every head turned when the doors opened. 60 people, perhaps more, and the quality of their attention was the specific quality of people who had been waiting and were now receiving what they waited for, which in this case appeared to be him. He had been looked at before in professional contexts, debriefings, reviews, one particularly unpleasant tribunal after an incident on a refueling station that had not been entirely his fault and had been mostly resolved through paperwork. He was familiar with the experience of being the subject of institutional attention. This was different in degree rather than kind, but degree, at sufficient magnitude, becomes its own category. He kept his posture correct and his expression neutral, and walked the length of the central space with the particular gait of someone determined not to appear as though they were concentrating on walking normally, which is the most effective way to appear as though you are concentrating on walking normally. At the far end, the platform, and on the platform, the throne, and in the throne, the queen. He had not known what to expect, which was honest, and had tried not to construct expectations, which was less successful. Queen Thesara was, and he assembled this impression in the way you assemble things when you are trying to remain professionally composed, not what the word queen had produced in any prior imagination. She was white-skinned in the way that some mineral surfaces are white, not pale but genuinely evenly so, with long blonde hair worn partially down, some of it gathered and some of it not, in a style that suggested the distinction between formal and informal was one she had decided was hers to define. Her robes were deep silver blue. Her ears, long and elegantly tapered in the manner of all Thessarans, carried small chains of pale metal that ran from their tips to a simple cuff behind each one, catching the distributed light without drawing attention to themselves, which was a form of jewelry confidence he found almost professionally impressive. Her expression was composed in the way that things are composed when composure is not an effort but a settled condition. She was looking at him the way someone looks at a thing they have already thought about at length and are now simply confirming. Ethan thought, "She is waiting to see what I do with being looked at like that." He did nothing with it, which felt like the correct response. He became aware, in the peripheral way that training produces, of a figure standing somewhat apart from the main arrangement of the court. Not quite with the nobles, not quite with the military advisors, occupying a space that seemed chosen rather than assigned. A younger woman, the same white complexion, the same long ears, though without the chain jewelry. She was watching him with an expression that he could not immediately categorize, which was unusual because he was generally competent at reading rooms. It wasn't hostility. It wasn't the fascinated contempt that some of the courtiers wore openly. It was something more considered than either. He filed it and returned his attention forward, because the queen was about to speak, and the room had already gone very quiet in anticipation of exactly that. A herald stepped forward and began reading. The charges, if that was the correct word, were delivered in formal Thessalonian, with a simultaneous translation being murmured near his ear by a small translation device one of the escort soldiers had attached to his collar before they entered. Border incursion, unauthorized presence in restricted sovereign territory, operation of a vessel within prohibited space. Each charge was delivered with the measured cadence of someone who had read things like this many times and understood that pace was a form of respect for the gravity of the occasion. Ethan listened and thought about the repair patch on his left shoulder, which he had noticed in the reflection of the cell's sanitation panel that morning and had been unable to do anything about. It was approximately 3 centimeters square, slightly darker than the surrounding fabric, and it was almost certainly the least appropriate thing in this room. He also had, he now realized, no idea what the proper form of address was for a Thessaran queen in a formal proceeding. He knew the word for thank you in Thessaran because Voss had told him by accident, and he knew the word for food, and he knew an impolite term he had overheard one of the corridor guards use when they thought no one was listening. None of these seemed applicable. The herald finished. The room waited. Queen Thessera looked at him for a moment that was long enough to be deliberate and short enough to be controlled, and then she spoke, and the translation device rendered her opening words into his ear with a fidelity that made the technology almost invisible. She asked him to explain himself. He thought, all right, honesty then. Tactically, it was all he had. And he began. He told the truth. Not because he was noble, and not because he had weighed his options and determined honesty to be strategically superior, though he had done that as well and reached the same conclusion. He told the truth because the alternative was constructing a lie in front of 60 people who had presumably heard many lies in this room and had developed, over time, the professional instincts of people who are lied to regularly and have learned to find it mildly insulting. He explained the navigation failure first, because it was the foundation of everything else, and because it was also, objectively, the most embarrassing part, and he had found that leading with embarrassing information early tended to produce a certain kind of credibility. His nav system had suffered a cascade failure, not an uncommon event, but one that had compounded in an unusual sequence, each redundancy failing in the window before the next one activated, like a series of doors closing just slightly too slowly. He had dropped out of his plotted course by a margin that seemed on paper correctable, until it wasn't. The queen listened. She did not interrupt. She did not change her expression. She listened the way structures listen, by simply remaining present and letting things occur within them. Then he explained the signal. This was the part he had rehearsed most carefully in the cell, across 11 days, in the quiet hours when Voss was not there to be argued with. The signal had carried a distress frequency, not an exact match to any human standard emergency band, but close enough that his system had flagged it, and close enough that he had looked at it, and close enough that he had made a decision that he was aware, even as he was making it, was not strictly within the parameters of his operational orders. He had followed it. He had entered restricted space. He had been detained within 20 minutes by a patrol that appeared with the efficiency of people who took their borders seriously, which, in retrospect, he respected. He finished. The room was quiet. Someone near the back of the court shifted weight from one foot to the other, which was the most movement the assembled court had produced since he had started talking. Queen Thessera said something, and the translation device said, in his ear, "You followed a signal you believed to be a distress call into territory you knew was prohibited without authorization because you believed someone might require assistance." "Yes," Ethan said. A pause. "And when you entered and found no distress situation, when you understood that you had been mistaken about the signal, what did you do?" "I attempted to exit the territory immediately," he said. "I was detained before I completed that." 20 minutes, the queen said. "Your patrols are very good," he said, which was the honest thing, and also, he suspected, not entirely the wrong thing to say in this room. Something moved through the court at that. Not quite a sound, not quite a shift, but the collective micro-expression of 60 people adjusting their assessment of a situation in real time. One of the senior advisors, a tall thesaurian with the bearing of someone who had spent decades being the most prepared person in most rooms, leaned very slightly toward the figure beside him and said something too quiet for the translation device to catch. Then the Queen raised one hand and the room settled, and she looked at Ethan Vale with the expression of someone who has arrived at a decision and is now simply finding the right place to put it. "I have considered your situation," she said, through the patient intermediary of the translation device. "At length, I will give you two options." The court received this with the attentive stillness of people who believed they knew what came next. Two options, in this room, in this proceeding, meant two things in the vocabulary of formal thesaurian judgment. Everyone present had the same quiet certainty of people watching a familiar piece of theater. The senior advisor straightened slightly, already composing his documentation face. "The first option," the Queen said, "is immediate freedom. Full escort to the border. All formal charges dissolved. You will be returned to your people without condition." The court absorbed this. It was generous. More generous than the proceeding had suggested, but it was within the range of outcomes that diplomatic pragmatism could explain, and experienced courtiers can absorb most things that fit within an explicable range. "The second option," the Queen said, and here she paused briefly, in the way that people pause when they are aware of the weight of what they are about to place on a sentence, "is marriage to my daughter, Princess Nithara, and a formal place within the royal household." The silence that followed was not the silence of a court awaiting further information. It was the silence of 60 people simultaneously attempting to locate the sentence they had just heard within any existing framework of understanding and finding the framework absent. It was the silence of experienced advisors whose faces had been professionally composed for decades, discovering, in real time, the limits of professional composure. It was a very specific silence, the kind that has texture and weight, and, if you were standing in the middle of it as Ethan was, a faintly vertiginous quality, like the moment after unexpected acceleration when the body has not yet caught up with what has happened to it. Ethan's mind did what trained minds do under unexpected conditions. It went very quiet and very precise, and attempted to reconstruct the input. He replayed the translation. He checked it against the thesaurian words he had partially caught before the device rendered them. He confirmed, with the systematic thoroughness of a man who wanted to be absolutely certain before he responded, that what he had heard was what had been said. It was. He became aware, without fully intending to, that his eyes had moved to the figure standing apart from the court, the young woman he had noticed when he entered, whose expression he had been unable to categorize. He looked at her now, and the categorization became, suddenly, significantly easier. Princess Nithara was looking at her mother with the expression of someone who has just discovered, in a very public setting, that a decision was made about them without their knowledge or consultation, and who is processing this discovery with the iron self-control of someone raised to never, under any circumstances, allow a room full of courtiers to witness their unfiltered reaction to anything. Her composure was intact. It was intact in the way that things are intact when considerable structural effort is being applied to keeping them that way. Somewhere in the back half of the court, a ceremonial staff hit the crystal floor. The sound it made was clean and resonant and traveled to every corner of the room with the acoustic efficiency of a space designed to carry sound to every corner. The advisor who had dropped it looked at it on the floor and appeared to be weighing the merits of pretending it had been intentional. Ethan looked back at the Queen. Queen Thisara was watching him with the same composed expression she had maintained throughout the entire proceeding, with the addition of something he couldn't quite name. Not satisfaction, not amusement, but something adjacent to both. The expression of someone observing a room react to something they have placed in it with full knowledge of the reaction it would produce. The translation device was quiet, because no one was speaking. The room was still producing its silence, which showed no immediate signs of resolving. Ethan thought about 11 days in a cell. He thought about the navigation failure and the distress signal and the 20-minute patrol response time. He thought about the repair patch on his shoulder and the unidentifiable orange food and Voss and his endlessly polished sidearm. He thought about the statistical improbability of a sequence of events that had begun with a cascade navigation failure and appeared to have arrived through a chain of intermediary events no modeling system would have predicted at this specific moment in this specific room. Then he looked at the Queen and said, with the careful pronunciation of a man who wanted to be absolutely certain he was understood, "I wonder if you could repeat that." The second option, "I want to make sure I heard it correctly." The advisor's staff was still on the floor. No one had moved to retrieve it. The Queen repeated it, word for word, with the same measured cadence, the same precise weight on each syllable, as though she had anticipated the request and had kept the sentence ready. The translation device rendered it into his ear with the same fidelity as the first time, which meant there was no comfort to be drawn from the possibility of technical error. The second option was the second option. It had not changed in the intervening 30 seconds. It was not going to change. The court had begun, slowly and unevenly, to recover the basic functions of a room full of people. Someone coughed. Someone else shifted. The advisor whose staff was on the floor had apparently decided that acknowledging it was worse than leaving it there, and so it remained, a small horizontal monument to the moment everything had become unexpected. Ethan noted that Princess Nithera had moved, marginally, not away, not forward, but a slight adjustment of posture that suggested she had made a private decision about how she was going to inhabit the next portion of this proceeding, whatever it turned out to be. Ethan looked at the Queen and asked the question that had organized itself at the front of his mind with the insistence of something that could not be deferred. "Why?" he said. It was a short question, but it had considerable contents, and the Queen appeared to receive all of them. She was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone searching for an answer, but the quiet of someone deciding where to begin with an answer they have already fully assembled. Then she spoke, and the translation device carried her words across to him with its customary invisible precision. She told him about the recordings. Every detention cell in the palace complex maintained a continuous environmental log. Not surveillance in the interrogative sense, but a passive record, a standard of documentation so embedded in palace protocol that most people forgot it existed. She had reviewed 11 days of his. Not all at once, and not, she said, because she had expected to find anything particular in them. She had reviewed them because it was her practice, when a situation was unusual, to look at the parts of it that no one else thought to examine. She had watched him do push-ups. She had watched him eat the unidentifiable food without complaint. She had watched him argue with Voss. And here something moved briefly across her expression, not quite amusement, but in the general neighborhood of it, with the specific quality of someone who was keeping themselves sane through the disciplined use of conversation, rather than deteriorating into the kind of behavior that isolation tends to produce in people who are not paying attention to themselves. She had watched him on the fourth day when a different guard, younger than Voss, visibly nervous, clearly new to the assignment, had fumbled the meal tray and sent half of it through the barrier slot onto the cell floor. Ethan had looked at the spilled food. He had looked at the guard, and he had told the guard it was fine, that the remaining half was probably the better half anyway, and that he had always felt that food with a floor component had more character. The guard had retrieved what he could and left quickly, and Ethan had eaten what remained without further comment. The Queen said that she had watched that moment several times. The court was very quiet, not the stunned quiet of the announcement. That had been an acute condition. This was something different. The quiet of people who are listening because they have begun to understand that what they are hearing matters, and that their earlier certainty about what this proceeding was had been a form of not paying attention. Ethan said carefully, "I behaved the way I would have wanted someone to behave in a room where I had made a mistake." "Yes," the Queen said. "That is precisely what I mean," she went on. She spoke about her daughter, not about Nithera as a political asset, not about the marriage option as a diplomatic instrument, but about what it meant to have watched a person, across 11 days of captivity and uncertainty and institutionally inadequate food, consistently choose decency when no one who mattered was watching. She said that the speechlessness of the court when she had announced the two options had told her everything she needed to know about what the court had assumed, about Ethan, and about Nythera, and about what either of them deserved to be offered. Ethan processed this. It was a great deal to process, and he gave it the time it required, which meant there was a silence. And the silence was the comfortable kind, which was in itself remarkable given the context. Then he said, "With respect, you structured an entire formal judicial proceeding to make a point to your court about your daughter's value." The Queen said nothing, but something in her expression confirmed it completely. "That," Ethan said after a moment, "is an extraordinary amount of administrative effort." From the side of the room, Princess Nythera made a sound. It was small and quickly suppressed, but it was identifiable. And it was the first genuinely unguarded thing Ethan had heard from anyone in this room since arriving, which made it, in his current assessment, the most interesting thing that had happened today. Several courtiers turned to look at her. She had already returned to composure, but the composure had a slightly different quality now, less like a wall and more like a window, something you could see a person through rather than just a surface. Ethan looked at her directly, which was perhaps not the correct protocol, but protocol had been having a difficult afternoon in general. "Princess," he said, and his translation device chirped softly, rendering it, "I want to be clear that I understand you were not consulted about this." She looked at him with the careful attention of someone recalibrating. "I was not," she said. Her voice carried through a small translation node near the platform. Someone had ensured she was mic'd, which suggested this moment had been anticipated by someone, possibly the Queen, who appeared to have anticipated most things. "Then I want you to know," Ethan said, "that whatever I decide, you should decide independently, and I don't think anyone in this room should assume otherwise." The princess was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You are a prisoner who just told a royal court that a princess of this house should exercise independent judgment in a matter her own mother proposed." "Yes." "In front of 60 courtiers." "There are a lot of witnesses," he agreed. "I considered that." Something shifted in the room then, not dramatically, not all at once, but the way temperature shifts when a window is opened, gradually and then evidently. The senior advisor bent down and picked up his ceremonial staff. It was a small action, but it had the quality of a signal, the proceeding reassembling itself around a new understanding of what it was. The Queen watched all of it with the expression of someone who has set something in motion and is observing where it goes, which is a specific kind of patience that belongs to people who plan carefully and then trust the plan. Ethan turned back to her. He had arrived at something, not a decision exactly, not yet, but the place where a decision becomes possible, which is its own kind of threshold. "I have a question," he said. "The first option, immediate freedom. You meant it genuinely." "I meant both options genuinely," she said. "Then I want to ask for a third one." The court produced a sound. It was collective and involuntary, and had the quality of an entire room forgetting, briefly, its professional training. "A third option," the Queen said without any particular inflection. "Time," he said. "Not freedom, not marriage. Time. To be here without being a prisoner and without being anything else yet. To learn what this place is. To have conversations that aren't conducted through a barrier." He paused. "To find out what the food is actually made of. Because 11 days of it, and I still have no working theory." The Queen looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at her daughter. Nythera was looking at Ethan with the expression he had been unable to categorize when he first entered the room, and he understood now what it was. It was the expression of someone encountering, unexpectedly, a thing they had not known to look for. "A third option," the Queen said finally, "was not on the formal record of this proceeding." "No," Ethan agreed. "It would require amendment of the judicial documentation. I imagine your administration is up to it." Something happened at the corners of the Queen's eyes. It was brief and it was controlled, but it was there. She looked at her assembled court, 60 people in various states of recovering their professional composure, and then she looked back at him. "Voss," she said. From near the door, Voss, who had apparently been present for this entire proceeding at the edge of the Escort formation, and had been polishing nothing because he had nothing to polish, snapped to attention. See to it that the prisoner's cell is reclassified, the Queen said. He is a guest. Voss said, Yes, Your Majesty, and then looked at Ethan with the expression of someone who had spent 11 days delivering unidentifiable food to a man who made jokes about mattress ratings and was still somehow surprised that it had come to this. Ethan looked around the room, at the Queen, who had orchestrated all of this with the patience of someone who plants things and waits for the right season, at Nithara, who was standing in her chosen space with a new quality to her stillness, something that was beginning to look like curiosity, at the court, reassembling itself around an outcome no procedural experience had prepared it for, at the staff, back in the advisor's hand, restored to its vertical dignity. He thought about the navigation failure. He thought about the distress signal he had followed into the wrong place at what was, apparently, precisely the right time. He thought about the cell and the push-ups and Voss and 11 days of food that remained taxonomically unresolved. He thought that the universe had a very specific sense of humor and that the least a person could do was appreciate it. Then he straightened his borrowed Thessaran clothes, adjusted his cuffs with their precise tapering points, and accepted, without further argument, that the most significant cascade failure of his career had also been the most consequential piece of navigation he had ever done, even if he hadn't known at the time where he was going. He rarely did. He was beginning to think that might be exactly the point.